prima che incontro al festoso fronte il lugubri suoi lampi il verbellini. It was very still in the small, neglected chapel. The noises of the farm came faintly through closed doors, voices shouting at the oxen in the lower fields, the querulous bark of the old house dog, and Philomena's angry calls to the little white-faced foundling in the kitchen. The February day was closing, and a ray of sunshine slanting through a slit in the chapel wall brought out the vision of a pale haloed head floating against the dusky background of the chancel, like a water lily on its leaf. The face was that of the Saint of Assisi, a shrunken, ravaged countenance lit with an ecstasy of suffering that seemed not so much to reflect the anguish of the Christ at whose feet the saint knelt as the mute pain of all poor downtrodden folk on earth. When the small Odo Valeska, the only frequenter of the chapel, had been taunted by the farmer's wife for being a beggar's brat, or when his ears were tingling from the heavy hand of the farmer's son, he found a melancholy kinship in that suffering face. But since he had fighting blood in him too, coming on the mother's side of the rude Piedmontese stock of the Marquesas di Donaz, there were other moods when he turned instead to the stout St. George in gold armour, just discernible through the grime and dust of the opposite wall. The chapel of Pontesordo was indeed as wonderful a storybook as fate ever unrolled before the eyes of a neglected and solitary child. For 100 years or more, Pontesordo, a fortified manor of the Dukes of Pianura, had been used as a farmhouse, and the chapel was never open save when, on Easter Sunday, a priest came from the town to say Mass. At other times it stood abandoned, cobwebs curtaining the narrow windows, farm tools leaning against the walls, and the dust deep on the sea gods and acanthus volutes of the altar. The manor of Pontesordo was very old. The country people said that the great warlock Virgil, whose dwelling place was at Mantua, had once shut himself up for a year in the topmost chamber of the keep, engaged in unholy researches. And another legend related that Alda, wife of an early lord of Pianura, had thrown herself from its battlements to escape the pursuit of the terrible Ezzelino. The chapel adjoined this keep, and Filomena, the farmer's wife, told Odo that it was even older than the tower, and that the walls had been painted by early martyrs who had concealed themselves there from the persecutions of the pagan emperors. On such questions a child of Odo's age could obviously have no pronounced opinion, the less so as Filomena's facts varied according to the seasons or her mood, so that on a day of east wind or when the worms were not hatching well, she had been known to affirm that the pagans had painted the chapel under Virgil's instruction to commemorate the Christians they had tortured. In spite of the distance to which these conflicting statements seemed to relegate them, Odo somehow felt as though these pale, strange people, youths with ardent faces under their small round caps, damsels with wheat-coloured hair, and boys no bigger than himself holding spotted dogs in leash, were younger and nearer to him than the dwellers on the farm. Jacques Pony the farmer, the shrill Filomena who was Odo's foster mother, the hulking bully their son, and the abbot who, once a week, came out from Pianura to give Odo religious instruction, and who dismissed his questions with the invariable exhortation not to pry into matters that were beyond his years. Odo had loved the pictures in the chapel all the better since the abbot, with a shrug, had told him they were nothing but old rubbish, the work of the barbarians. Life at Pontesordo was in truth not very pleasant for an ardent and sensitive little boy of 9, whose remote connection with the reigning line of Pianura did not preserve him from wearing torn clothes and eating black bread and beans out of an earthen bowl on the kitchen doorstep.
Go ask your mother for new clothes.
Filomena would snap at him when his toes came through his shoes and the rents in his jacket sleeves had spread beyond darning.
These you are wearing are my gianazos, as you well know, and every rag on your back is mine if there were any law for poor folks. For not a copper of pay for your keep or a stitch of clothing for your body have we had these 2 years come Assumption. What's that? You can't ask your mother, you say, because she never comes here? true enough. Fine ladies let their brats live in cow dung, but they must have Indian carpets under their own feet. Well, ask the abbot then. He has lace ruffles in his coat and a naked woman painted on his snuff box. What? He only holds his hands up when you ask? Well, then go ask your friends on the chapel walls. Maybe they'll give you a pair of shoes. Though St. Francis, for that matter, was the father of the discalced, and would doubtless tell you to go without.
And she would add with a coarse laugh,
Don't you know that the discalced are shod with gold?
It was after such a scene that the beggar noble, as they called him at Pontesordo, would steal away to the chapel and, seating himself on an upturned basket or a heap of pumpkins, gaze long into the face of the mournful saint. There was nothing unusual in Odo's lot. It was that of many children in the 18th century, especially those whose parents were cadets of noble houses, with an appanage barely sufficient to keep their wives and themselves in court finery, much less to pay their debts and clothe and educate their children. All over Italy at that moment, had Odo Valesca but known it, were lads whose ancestors, like his own, had been dukes and crusaders, but who, nonetheless, were faring as he fared on black bread and hard blows, and the half-comprehended taunts of unpaid foster parents. Many, doubtless, there were who cared little enough as long as they might play morrow with the farmers' lads and ride the colt bareback through the pasture and go bird netting and frog hunting with the village children. But some, perhaps like Odo, suffered in a dumb animal way, without understanding why life was so hard on little boys. Odo, for his part, had small taste for the sports in which Giannozzo and the village lads took pleasure. He shrank from any amusement associated with the frightening or hurting of animals, and his bosom swelled with the fine gentleman's scorn of the clowns who got their fun in so coarse a way. Now and then he found a moment's glee in a sharp tussle with one of the younger children who had been tormenting a frog or a beetle, but he was still too young for real fighting, and could only hang on the outskirts when the bigger boys closed, and think how someday he would be at them and break their lubberly heads. There were thus many hours when he turned to the silent consolations of the chapel. So familiar had he grown with the images on its walls that he had a name for every one: the king, the knight, the lady, the children with guinea pigs, basilisks and leopards, and lastly the friend, as he called St. Francis. An almond-faced lady on a white palfrey with gold trappings represented his mother, whom he had seen too seldom for any distinct image to interfere with the illusion. A knight in damascened armour and scarlet cloak was the valiant captain, his father, who held a commission in the ducal army, and a proud young man in diadem and ermine, attended by a retinue of pages, stood for his cousin, the reigning